Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. If anyone has any problem hearing me, let me know. Okay. So just a recap of what we did yesterday. We're working on this register insurance. Okay. There we had two flows, which is add insurance policy flow, and we had add insurance flow. Okay. And then we had a registration which was already created. Okay. For this, we had the API path in policies. This was our API path. We made a post for here. Okay. And we have our basically create policy here at this point. We have a policy creation request, which has items covered, maximum sum insured, and type of insurance. And we had a policy created response, which has the ID, items covered, max sum insured, and insurance type. Okay. This was for policy controller. Then we had something called insurance. We'll have something called insurance controller. Okay. So what is we also discussed this thing, like when you're trying to create a policy, what are the things you can have? You can either send 201 or you can send 409 if a policy already exists, or 500 in case something goes wrong internally. Okay. So we go back to our policy controller. This actually looks fine. You have a policy creation request which you're converting to your model. Model is something that your insurance service understands. You're passing this to them, to the service, and service is giving the created policy back to you. Based on the created policy, you're basically sending the creation response. Because we don't have, okay. So you're creating the policy created response, and you're sending it. If everything works fine, you're sending 201, which is created. In case there is a duplicate insurance policy exception, okay, you're throwing a conflict. And in case there is any other exception, you throw an internal server error. Okay, in the insurance part, we have these methods. Insurance service, we have these methods, and this method actually has this private method, which basically checks if the insurance policy already exists or not. And then if it is, it basically returns this. For now, we're just returning null. Okay. All right. This was that. Then the next thing we tried to implement was add insurance flow. Okay. Now, for the add insurance flow, we needed the request type. We needed the model. The model for this is basically insurance. Insurance has its own ID, name, status, created on, expired on, and policy ID. Okay. So creating the insurance has a dependency on the policy ID. Okay. So this is how it will basically happen in these steps. Fetch policy details by policy ID. Okay. If no policy is found, through exception, or not through exception, return optional of null. Controller will return a 400. Okay, so now it will be 400. Bad request. You gave me an ID, gave me a policy number which I don't have. Yeah. Then basically I'll go ahead. Then we'll try to create. Check if insurance already exists or not. If yes, code exception, and controller returns a 409. Okay, and country is basically create. This is what we're doing. So we already have the model here. What we don't have is the request. So I'll go ahead and create a insurance creation request. Okay. All right. We had a particular this thing, right? We said that for an insurance, we'll actually have these things. Okay, we'll have the name, all these things, and we'll also have the policy ID. Okay, that's basically how the request will look like. And then we have to return a response. Now the response would look a little different as we decided in last class. Response would look something like this. Response would look like this, where you have insurance ID, and then you have basically all of these things. Status. We have the pager on. Expired. And then instead of policy ID, we'll just return the policy operation. So policy will have its own. ID items are recognized. I think it's yeah. You get the drill that we have to basically have a nested out. So what we're going to do is we already have a policy created response in here. We'll basically just embed this thing inside the final response. Okay. So in my response, I'll create this thing. We call it insurance created response. Okay. And here I'll have the data part, and I'll just have everything about the insurance. Basically all of these things, and then instead of policy data, we just have policy created response. Okay. That's all we're going to have. This would be our response here. All right, let's go ahead and write the controllers. So far, we have just done the very basic things. Let's say insurance controller. Risk controller. Risk mapping. First thing is creation. Public. Okay. What is the response type? Insurance created response. Okay. Create insurance. Insurance creation request. This is the post request, so I'll have to have the request. Here, a post mapping. Because I'm going to need to convert data back and forth, I'll implement this object mapper. Okay, object mapper. And because it needs to be configured so that it doesn't fail on unknown properties, I'll go ahead and say private void init object mapper dot configure. Deserialization feature fail on unknown properties false. Okay, and annotate this with post construct so that okay, this will be used for conversion post construct is used for reconfiguring the object mapper, and this is our okay. So first thing is log.info received insurance creation request. Now, basically, we'll need a dependency of insurance service, right? So we'll go ahead here. I'll say insurance service. Insurance service. Yeah. We just injected our dependency here. Now we have to basically call this insurance service dot create insurance. Now this guy requires an insurance type. So what I'll say is insurance object mapper. Okay, dot convert value from request to insurance class. This will convert it to insurance object. If you just want to check how it looks, converted insurance and then we'll basically pass this insurance object here, and we'll reassign this thing. So this will be the created insurance. It will have the ID and everything. Okay, but we missed a step. We have to first validate that the policy that there is something of this policy, right? So even before we go there, let us get the final long policy ID request dot get policy ID. Okay, now I have to basically check if the policy is there or not. Okay, so I say final optional of insurance policy. Okay, insurance policy optional insurance service dot get insurance policy by ID. Here I'll pass the policy ID. Okay. What did we do here? We received the request. We extracted the policy ID from this. We queried the insurance service that, hey, is there a policy by this policy ID? It is going to give me an option because this API, this method, always promises to return something. This is basically a wrapper, and on this, in this wrapper, I have to check if the value is present or not. Okay. So, what will happen if I do not have that present? Okay. So I'll say if insurance policy option is present. If it is not present, okay, so with this, I will basically issue a warning here. No policy found by ID policy. Okay. Now, at this point, you have the user has passed me a policy ID which does not exist in my database, right? Which means that it's a bad request. They have passed me a parameter which is not there in my system. Okay. So what I can do is I can basically write this message here.
Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, line number 14, please explain this. Log.1 44, sir.
Line number 44. This part. This is just a warning.
Yeah,
this is
sir.
info. This is warning. It basically they do in different color. So log actually has different levels, right? I'm not going to go too much into the details of it, but log actually has many levels. Okay, you have a level called info, you have a level called debug, you have a level called warn, and you have a level called error. Okay, these are the basic logging errors that you will find in any library. Okay, info basically means that it will print like all the information, everything we have here. Debug is mostly used for like by mostly when you're developing the application and you want to quickly test something, print something, you would use debug. Warning is when you want the system to when you want so basically let me tell you the story why we use these things. Okay. majority of the applications running anywhere you go, they have a system that watches the performance of the application. Okay, if you deploy your Spring Boot application there, and how the Spring Boot application is performing is actually determined by many of the factors. One of such factor is log here. So what happens is when you use something like this will actually log all of this information on your file. Okay, and that file is actually continuously read by some monitoring system. In that monitoring system, if something comes as information, it will go out for analytics and everything. If something comes as warning, it will go out as warning. If something comes as error, it will go out as error. Now, why do we have these? I mean, these four separations here? Because let's say your system is getting more errors than it should. Okay, so using log.error will basically print the error, and whichever system is monitoring behind the scene, okay, whichever system is monitoring your Spring Boot application behind the scene, they will actually be looking for these error logs. I mean, all the logs that are there with error. Similarly, if you have some warning there, let's say your system is generating more warning than it should, okay, then so let's say somebody is continuously hitting this API with a bad policy ID. Okay, so this will always be generated. Let's say you expect that you will have 100 requests every day, and of that 100 requests, only for 20 some requests will come with a bad policy ID. If that number goes to 21, then basically whichever system is monitoring will basically look for the warning logs. It will do a collection of warning logs. If it finds that the warning log is more than 20, it will immediately warn the developers and whoever there are, engineering managers and everyone, that there is something unusual happening with the system. And basically these are for system metrics. How a system is performing, you put your log for that, and logging actually has different levels. It basically tells you what is happening. So here I'm just plainly implementing everything there is. Okay, in this warning here, I'm basically telling the system that there is something which has happened, which is not an error, but it's a warning. Somebody has hit my API without giving me the proper policy ID. That's what we're doing here. Okay, this is clear. This is basically for metrics. You don't have to worry much about these things. It's basically for metrics measurement. So we have to send that. Okay. So can anyone tell me what message I should be sending in? Like what would be the HTTP status code? Anyone? Take a guess, man. Like if it's wrong or correct.
200.
400? Correct. Yes. Correct. It is a 400. But then let's say that the system already had such a policy ID. Okay, somebody created this policy ID, and then by the time you create this request, somebody has already come and deleted the policy ID. In that case, was it the requester's fault that he passed the policy ID wrong? Did you understand my problem? You created a policy with the ID 123. Okay, and then at this step, you're trying to create the insurance. But somewhere here, somebody has access to your API. They go ahead and issue this command, delete 123. Okay, so when you say create insurance with 123, okay, should you be throwing a 400 because this client knew that there was 123, right? Should you be throwing a 400 or 409 or 404? Any guess? Okay. Yes. Basically, in that scenario, this is a real example. Like it can happen many times that you have added something to your cart, but by the time you're checking out, that item is gone. Okay.
Sir, your
Voice is too low now. Hello, clear now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. All right. So for now, in this case, we'll basically return a 400. Okay. So what did I do here? I printed the warning log saying, hey, somebody has hit my system with a policy ID that doesn't exist in my system. Then I'm basically constructing the error message here using string.format. where I'm saying no such policy found and ampersand s, and I'm replacing that ampersand s, sorry, percentage s with policy ID. Okay, this is my message. Now, what I'll do here is return response entity. Okay. Here you have object body, multi-value map string headers, and then state rows. Okay. So we'll basically we'll send null because there is nothing at this point, and we'll send the state of HTTP bad request. Okay. Cool. Now, if you look here and this API, right? There are many reasons for which a bad request can go. Okay, you can have a bad request because the policy ID passed is this. Okay, similarly, you can have a bad request because they expired. I mean, the created date or the status is invalid or something like that. Okay, so in many cases, you can have uh, like there are many possibilities for which an API can give you a bad request. You have 1, 2, 3, 4. Sorry, this should not have the ID. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You have 5 fields for which all 5 of them, if passed incorrect data, can return 5 bad requests. Okay. So from the client's point of view, whoever is hitting this API, if you send that guy null and bad request, how will the guy know what the bad request was for? Was it because the status was wrong, or was it because the name was incorrect, or was it because the created on date was incorrect, or was it because the policy was incorrect? You understand the problem I'm trying to say here, right? That if you return this thing, your client doesn't really know what went wrong. It knows that I have done something wrong because I have received a bad request, but what has gone wrong? In a situation like this, we have to create a response object. Okay. Basically, you create a class which will contain enough information so that the client knows what went wrong and exactly what HTTP status code they should receive. Okay. For those who are still confused, let me reiterate this once again. A bad request can come because the policy ID is wrong, or maybe the created on date is wrong, or maybe the status is wrong, or maybe the name is wrong. 4 different reasons for bad request. If you send just null and bad request here, how will the client know what went wrong? Was it because policy ID, or was it because the name, or was it because status? For this reason, we are going to create something which will actually wrap around this particular object. You already have response entity here which wraps this insurance object, but as you can see from here, like if you look at this at this point, right, you have an insurance, you can pass an HTTP status, you can pass an insurance created body, you can pass a multi-value map, you can pass this and headers and status. There is no way basically to know what went wrong. Okay, so if you want to send an error message, obviously response entity is not the only thing that you should use. This is where a response wrapper kind of class needs to be created, which will basically have few constant fields and one variable field, which is this. Give me a second. All right. So now see what we basically do. Okay, this when you're designing an API, your API should look like this. Okay, your return should look like this. Your response body should have a message saying what really happened. Okay, and it should have the actual data. It should contain whatever data you have, and this can be a variable thing. Like you can have a data of a JSON, or you can have a data of array or anything like that. But if you want to tell the client exactly what went wrong there, you need to have one more field along with the data, which means, so in our case, what we were doing was we were just returning this thing. So we were, our entire object was looking just like this. We had HTTP, we had our status code, okay, in our response body. When we were receiving the response, we have the status code and the date, right? But you can see that that's not enough, because in this case, the client really doesn't know what went wrong. Okay, so if you want to tell the client exactly what went wrong, you need to modify a little bit. Okay, so first thing what we're going to do here is we're going to create a class called API response. Okay, this API response will have something called message. Okay, then it will have something called data, and it will have something called error. Okay, what this will do is, if it is a success, you would have your message as success or something like this, whatever message you choose. If it's a successful thing, this part will have whatever is needed. It could be an array, or it could be, I mean, it could be a JSON or an array of JSON like this. Okay. But if there is a conflict, or if the request was not successfully processed, okay, you will have to specify what error it is, and along with that, you have to give the message. Okay. So what we'll do here is we will basically maintain something called code description. Actually, let's remove this message. Okay. These are the two fields we're going to have. We'll have a data, and we'll have an error, and this thing. Okay. So if this is what we return to our client, let's see if the client can figure out if something goes wrong or if something is successful. Okay. So when I pass this thing through response entity, you can imagine the response entity to look something like this. So this is how we're going to do it. Okay, we're going to create this internal part. Okay, we're going to create this internal part because response entity, as you can see, it already takes care of the HTTP request, HTTP status for you. So you don't have to worry about the status, but you have to create this API response, which will basically wrap your data and error together. Okay, so let's say the request is successful. If the request is successful, the first thing that the client would check is the HTTP status. If the HTTP status is 200 or 201, the client knows that things went fine. Okay. If it is anything else, let's say if it is a 400, or if it's a 4xx, or if it's a 5xx, right? In that case, so before we go there, if it's a 2xx, then the client would be looking for whatever is there in the data. And at that point, if the HTTP status is 2xx, the error body would be null, as in there would be no error there. Okay, this would be null, and this would actually have data. Okay? However, if this becomes 4xx or 5xx, okay, by xx I mean 500 or 501, okay? Then your data part would be null, and error would have a. Okay? Any questions here?
Sir, can you repeat this thing again, sir? Because since
Can I repeat what?
yes, sir. Can you repeat this responsibility this part, sir?
So you understood the problem here, right? I have four possible ways five possible reasons why I can return a bad request. Okay. And on top of that, if something happens, if the system crashes, I have to return a 500. Now, if I return a 500 or 400, I don't know exactly what went wrong, right? Because as of now, my API just returns null if there is nothing and a bad request, but it doesn't return anything more than that. So I cannot tell, the client cannot know what went wrong, right? So I have to give the client back something with which the client can identify exactly what went wrong. In here, if any of these fields are wrong, it will be returning a bad request. So I have to send the client something with which the client can figure out, okay, only policy ID is wrong, or okay, only a created on is wrong, or okay, only status is wrong. Okay, this much part is clear. So what we are going to do is we're going to create a response. We already have the response entity. Response entity will basically take care of the HTTP status. Okay, so if the client looks at the HTTP status and it finds out of 200 or 201 or 4xx or 5xx, if it finds 2xx, it knows my request is successful. If it finds 4xx or 5xx, it knows that my request is not successful, right? But if it needs to know more information, like why it is a 500 or why it is a 4xx, then we will be introducing this class called API response. It is nothing but a wrapper class. Okay, this wrapper class will have two things: data and error. Okay, now what is this data part here? This data part can be anything. This data part can be this data part can be insurance created response or policy created response, depending on which API you hit. Okay, the data part would change. Okay, error part would have a code, basically a code. Okay, and along with that maybe a description. So if it's a 4xx or 5xx, the data part here would be null. So if the client wants to know more information about what exactly went wrong, they can look at the code. Let's say policy number went wrong, right? So we'll send them ERR. This is a custom error message, ERR001. Okay, and we'll say policy ID incorrect. Okay, if let's say the creation time is wrong, we'll send them ERR002, which would mean invalid creation time. Okay, for both these reasons, okay, the HTTP status would be 400. It will be 400. But tell me this thing: if this was not there and you received a 400, would you be able to tell exactly what went wrong, Abhishek? If you just had this data, would you be able to tell me why the 400 happened, Abhishek? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you will be able to tell if you just have 400 here, let's say 400. Can you tell why the 400 happened? Why? What exactly went wrong? Was the policy ID wrong, or the creation date wrong, or the status wrong? Can you tell from here? You cannot tell, right? Because there is no extra information here. You just have data here, which is null, and then you have the HTTP status code. So we will introduce this part, error part. Okay, this error part will have these things. So in this error part, every code will have a message to it. Okay, so if the client receives error, this message, they know that it is the policy ID that went wrong. If they receive error 002, they know that creation time is invalid. This is how we are going to design our API. Okay. So to do that, let's go back here. In my response here, I'll create this class called API response. Okay. Now, if you see here, in my policy response, instead of basically creating an API, instead of returning policy created response, I'll say API response. Okay. Now, if you look at this, if I return an API response, what would be the data? The data would be policy created response for this controller and registered DTO for this controller, insurance created response for this controller. Okay, which means the data part here is not fixed. Okay, the data part here is variable, which means we will have to use generics. Okay, so what I'll do here is I'll create an API response class and I'll say T. Okay, then in here we'll say private T data, and we'll have to create an error class here, error response. Okay. Here we'll say private string code, private string description. Okay. Now here you have data, no arts constructor, all arts constructor. Okay. Don't worry about these two things. And then in my API response part, this is my data. Error response. Just say that. Here runs this data on arts constructor. So now what I'll do is, firstly, I'll go to my insurance controller here. And in this, instead of sending the insurance created response, we're going to send API response. And there it will be insurance created response. I know you're very confused at this point. So let me take you guys through this once again. Earlier, I was just sending this. I was sending HTTP status, and I was sending the data. Okay. If this is 400 or 401, this would be null. We couldn't tell what this 400 there was. If there was 400, what was it 400? So we decided to introduce one more field called error. Okay. This error field would have a code and a description. Okay. So if it's 400 here, you look at the error part and you see if the error is ERR01, then it's a policy ID incorrect. If this is ERR002, this is something we are defining. It's an invalid creation. Okay. So now your data, your response data would look like this, where you have the HTTP status, then you have your data, then you have your error. Okay. So this is the part for which I created this API response class. Okay. This API response here, error response is always fixed. Error response is always going to have just two fields, code and description. But the data part here, the reason why I chose this to be generic is because for different controllers, it returns different response. For registration controller, the data part is going to be registered DTO. For policy controller, the return type would be policy created response. For insurance controller, the return type would be insurance created response. So the data part of this is not fixed. Based on which API you hit, it can change. Okay. So instead of doing this, instead of keeping it as object, I have decided to mark it with a T. T would basically mean it can be a generic. It can be anything. Okay. So now if we modify our response like this, this is how it will look. Okay. If you have, so let's look at this thing. If you are not able to find the policy ID, it's a bad request, right? So what you do here is you create this API response of insurance created response. Okay. API response, new API response. Okay. Here, response data, there is nothing. So you will say null. Okay. You have to now create the error data. So you say new error response, or if it's too much for you, let me actually go ahead and create this separately. So first thing is, what is the error? The error is policy is not found. What did we decide? We decided the error would be ERR001. Okay. So we would say ERR001. And then we're going to say whatever message we constructed it, we pass that. Okay. This message, no policy found for this ID. No such policy found for ID. Okay. Done. And then here, the data part would be null because in case of a 4xx, the data part is null, so data part is null here. And the error message would be this error message. Okay, done. Then here, instead of sending null, because earlier we were just sending the data and this, but now we are sending all three of them. So which means that it is going to be of API response, because you can see here, insurance created response is wrapped by API response, which is then wrapped by response. Okay, so in my API response here, null is the data, error response is the error part. Okay, then in here I'll basically pass the API response. Okay. This will check if if this thing is present or not. If it is present, what you will do is you go ahead and let's take a look at this. Yeah, okay, now if you do have the policy, you get the policy part. So you say insurance policy, you say policy, insurance policy option. Okay. Now you have the policy response here. Now what you will do is you'll actually take the request, convert that request to insurance object. Okay. Then you'll call your insurance service to create the insurance. And once you have your insurance ready, you will have to convert it back to insurance created response. Okay. So if you look at my insurance created response, this actually has the policy created response as a part of its dependency. So first thing is I have to convert this insurance policy to policy created response. Okay. If you guys are confused, let me know. Okay. Don't keep quiet. So this is the policy created response, and this is my insurance policy. So I'll have to convert this to this. Okay. So for that, what I'll do is object network dot guys, stop me if you have some confusion. Insurance policy is the source, destination is done. Okay. So in our insurance created response, we have this policy created response, which we have just created, right? We have just created policy created response. Now the next part is basically create these things. Okay. Now let's take a look at this. This is my insurance class. Insurance class has policy ID, string, expired on, and everything. Okay. And insurance created response has all these things. So ID matches, ID will be mapped. Name matches, name will be mapped. Status matches, that will be mapped. Created on matches, that will be there. Expired on matches, that will be there. Policy ID and policy don't match, so they won't be mapped. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll convert this insurance part to this insurance created response. So I'll say insurance created response, object mapper dot convert value from insurance to insurance created response dot class. Okay. Now insurance created response has a policy created response, which we created here at this stage. So let's say insurance created response dot set policy created response is done. We now construct the API response of insurance created response. Okay. We look here, what is the data type? The data in this case is not null. So we say insurance created response, and the error part will be. So in this case, the data was null because there was an error, and error response had something. In this case, because the data was successfully created, data is not null, error is null. Now we basically return new response entity where you say object body is API response and it is created, right? So HTTP status created. Done. Okay. Now, if in this case, if we go inside our this method, create insurance method, you can see that it basically throws two exceptions: insurance policy not found exception, okay, and my bad. So basically, your service layer, the fact that you have to inquire the policy first and then get to this is actually done by your this part, insurance policy not found exception. So you can remove that part altogether, or you can actually leave this part here because the ultimate response would require this. But if you look at this implementation here, there are two possible exceptions that can be thrown. Okay, which is one is this and one is this. So how do you handle this? It in your controller, you will basically wrap this entire thing inside a runtime. Now, what are the possible exceptions you're going to catch? Invalid date. So you're getting an insurance policy date exception and insurance policy not found exception. So you would say in insurance date not policy date exception or insurance policy not found exception. These are the two exceptions you're handling. Both of these exceptions mean there is a bad request, right? So in that case, you will basically have to send a 400. But depending on this, so if it's a date exception, okay, we have said that if it's a date exception, we'll send ER00. And if it's a policy not found exception, we'll send ER00. If you see here, at this point, we are already doing this, right? We're already doing the check and then we're constructing this thing. So we can actually move all of this part here, like away from this to this. Okay. What did I do here? At this step, we're basically checking if the policy is there or not, right? If there is no policy, we already have a catch block for handling such cases. So instead of writing my case here to return the response, why don't I stop the execution here by throwing this exception called throw new, what is that thing? Insurance policy not found exception. Okay, and here I pass my message. Sorry. Okay. Which means this exception thrown at this point will come to this. Exception thrown from inside the service will also be caught here. Okay. Now at this place, I have to basically decide what type of error it is. Is it the date exception or is it the policy exception? So for that, what you can do is, if E is an instance of insurance date policy date exception, you know that the date given is wrong. So you will say, you create this API response. You create the error response first. Error response, new error response. Okay. Code is supposed to be ERR002 creation invalid creation date. Okay. This will be the error response. Okay. Actually, let me do it like this. Error response. Else response. So if it is not insurance policy date exception, then by default it will be insurance policy not found exception, because these are the only two exceptions I'm catching. Okay. So here I'll say error response. Now, for insurance policy not found exception, the error code was ERR001. No such policy found by ID. Just pass the policy ID. So it will be in your request or get policy. Okay, done. These are the two error responses that will be created. Now, what we have to do is we have to return we have to create an API response with this. So finding API response of insurance created response, API response, new API response. In both the cases, whenever I'm inside the catch block, I know that I have no data because something went wrong. So it will be none. The error message can be anything. Based on the if else block here, the error message will be decided. And once I'm done with this, I'll just go ahead and say return new response entity. Okay. Now, both of these are 400, right? So API response and HTTP status bad. That's it. If you want to catch one more exception, which is in case something goes wrong, okay, you will say exception in. So if it is neither this nor that, that means something inside the system has crashed, right? Which is a 500 internal server error. In that case, what you will do is you create this error response. Okay, let's decide the code here. If something has gone wrong, we'll send this error G00000. Okay, this means internal server. Okay, so error response, new error response. Here you will say G00000. Something went wrong. Please try again after some time. Okay, that's it. And then create an API response out of it. API response of insurance. API response, new API response. Here the data part would be null, the error part would be this, and basically return new response entity, API response, and HTTP status internal server. Done. Okay. So if you look at this, if you want me to take you guys through this again, I'm checking the policy ID. I'm basically trying to get the policy ID. In case there is no policy ID, no such policy ID, I'm basically throwing this insurance policy not found at this point. And then it will be caught here and it will send this this error, this part here, okay, because it will be throwing insurance policy not found. If everything goes fine, it will create this policy created response. Then it will go inside the service layer at the create response part. There also there is this check. There also this insurance policy not found can be thrown, and along with that, this insurance policy date exception can also be thrown. So I'm basically catching those exceptions here. If any of these exceptions are happening, I'm basically constructing the error response based on what type of exception it is. Okay, if it's this, if it's the date exception, I'm sending an error code of ERR002 invalid creation date. If it's this, I'm sending them ERR001. And then basically I'm creating the response and I'm sending the issue which is a bad request. Otherwise, if some other exception happens, that means it is an internal server error, which I wasn't expecting. So I'm going to send basically this. And this is the code I have decided, G. G stands for global. Okay? And yeah, that's it. If we just test our API now, we are posting. We have a problem. Mojo execution. So it's saying that there is no insurance service in the configuration. Otherwise, okay. So, this doesn't have the service indication. Okay. Let's run this. First thing we'll do is check our API here. Insurance controller comes under insurance, right? This application is around 5%. So go ahead and set it to speed. I've actually opened a duplicate tab here. Insurances, okay. And then there will be this thing. What is the request? Creation request name, which I have. I've got it. Mobile 2. Okay. Then we have status. This is the status. Okay. Then we have insurance created on. Say today is then we have expired on. I'll leave it as blank. Then we have policy. This is my response here. It is obviously going to show an error because there is no such policy. Okay. You can see we're getting a 400 bad request, right? And then in here, it says ERR001, no such policy found by ID 123. Now, you, Postman as a client, or you as a client, if you were implementing this thing, and let's say you did not have this error code, you just received the data as null, okay? If you just had this thing, and you had the 400 status code, you would not know what went wrong. Because you have ERR001 here, you know that there is one specific type of problem that happened, which is the policy ID is wrong. Okay. So the question is, why are we not going with the description here? Why do we have to maintain a code here? Because code is something that doesn't change. The description can change. And based on sometimes, if you are like, let's say you want to show this error message to your consumer. Let's say you are a Facebook application, okay? As in you are the Facebook Android application, okay? You are hitting Facebook server. Now Facebook has many types of Facebook runs on many languages, Hindi, English, and French, and all these things, right? Let's say you want to customize your message, okay? As in if the Facebook user is in France, you want to send the same message in French, which is why we cannot rely on description alone. The code here is always going to stay ERR001. Okay. The description here can be anything. This can be in English, this can be in French, this can be in Hindi, this can be in Bengali. no problem with this. But code is something that we always follow because the code never actually changes. This is why. So first thing is HTTP status alone is not enough to let the client know what went wrong. And if we are trying to let the client know what went wrong, we have to at least maintain these two things. So one is the code and one is the response. Code is going to basically remain static. Like if it's this code, then it is no policy found. If it's something else, then it's some other thing. Okay. The data part gets returned. In any case, if you did not have an error, then this part would be null and this part would have the response object. Okay. Yep. That's for this. We'll take a quick 10-minute break and come back. Okay. I hope everyone is back. So just to recap, we created this insurance policy flow, and then we added this insurance flow where we fetch the policy details by policy ID and then check if the insurance already exists or not, and then create and return the details. Okay. Now, in our API, okay, in our API, there's actually this way in which we are handling the exception, right? As in the service layer throws the exception, and then you apply your try catch block here, and then throw your exception here. Okay. If you look at this, if you look at this particular controller here, right? You can see that in the insurance controller, uh, you have these two errors, okay? Insurance policy date exception and insurance policy not found exception that can be thrown from here, okay? Only from this controller, which is fine. Then there's this general exception, which is thrown from here. If you look at other controllers, like registration controller here also something can happen, okay? As in here also you can try catch this entire thing. You can see that here also I basically am catching this insurance policy not found exception. So in this controller, I am catching this insurance policy not found exception. Here also I am catching this insurance policy not found exception, okay? Uh, in this, in policy controller, I have duplicate insurance policy exception and I have normal exception. Okay. If you look at these three controllers here, policy controller, registration controller, and insurance controller, you will see the exception handling mechanism being repeated. Okay. For example, this part here, catch exception this, is implemented in this controller as well as in the policy controller. So if something goes wrong, then you return this. Okay. If something goes wrong, then you return this. This is a redundant code. Okay. As in, you are doing the same thing in two different places. So if you look at this thing, registration controller can throw insurance policy not found exception, and insurance controller can also throw this insurance policy not found exception. So the same thing, okay, being implemented in two different places. Okay. In when you design a full-fledged API, for now we're just working with small data sets, but when you actually design full-fledged APIs, you will have many places where similar or same exceptions will be thrown. Okay. This guy is throwing this exception, some other controller will be throwing some similar exception. Okay. So you cannot go ahead and have a try catch block in every one of the controllers. Like you cannot come at this controller and say, okay, implement this insurance policy not found exception, and then implement the same method in here as well. Okay. And then tomorrow, if you have another controller which throws the insurance policy not found exception, there also you will have to implement the same mechanism. Okay. So instead of doing this, Spring gives you a concept of, let me open a new sheet, global exception handler. Okay. There is this concept called global exception handler, which is where common exceptions can be caught and handled. Okay. So in our APIs, we have three APIs, right? Insurance controller, registration controller, policy controller. All three of them can throw this normal exception, okay? Which is whenever this exception of this type happens, we are going to send an internal server exception, internal server error, which means all three of them are doing the same thing. So why not put them in a common place, which is a global exception handler? Okay. So here what we'll do is we'll introduce a new concept called controller advisors. Okay, Spring has this component called REST controller advisor. Okay, it is basically nothing but a global exception. Okay, let's see how we do this. We'll create a package here called controller advisors. Okay. Here I'll say I'll create a class called global exception handler. Okay. Now pay attention to the following things. First thing is SLA forgery. Okay. Okay. Second thing I'll do is REST controller advice. Okay. What this does is that it basically says that this particular exception handler is going to be a global exception handler. Okay. This annotation REST controller advisor basically says that this class is going to be handling some kind of exception globally. Okay, which means if there is some error that happens here, the controller does not have to handle it. The handling mechanism can be shifted to a global exception handler. It's this. Okay. So let's see how this happens. We are going to handle just the exception, the internal server error wala part here. Okay. For this, what we do is we say public. Okay. And what is the API response that we want? We want to send a response entity of API response. Okay. Now, since this is a like every controller here will send a null data, right? Every controller will send a null data. So for this controller, the expected return type is insurance created response. For this controller, the expected return type is registered DTO. For this policy controller, the expected return type is policy created response. But when it comes to this, when it comes to, let's say, just simple exception class here, you can see that I'm just setting the data to null. In the policy, in the registration controller, I haven't implemented it. Sorry. Yeah, I haven't implemented it, but basically here also you check that for exception, I'm basically sending null. So if you have an internal server error, you want the data part to be null. So in this case, I won't be typing insurance created response or something like policy created response. Okay, because the data type is there will be no data type. It will be a null data. So for that to happen, you have something called void. Void is a class. It's similar to how the void keyword works. Okay, but this is a wrapper class. Okay, whenever you say void, which means that the internal data part is always going to be null. Okay, here I'll say handle global exception. Okay, argument would be the exception key. What I'll do here is error handling global exception. And I'll simply pass that exception. Now, whenever this thing happens, that means it's an internal server response, right? So I'll create an error response, new error response. I said the code would be G00000. Oops. Something went wrong. Please try again. Okay, this would be my error response. API response of void. You can see here that I'm not specifying any specific type of data. I'm giving it void because the data type would be null. Okay, API response, new API response. Here the data type void data, so I'll pass a null here. Error response and pass error response. So this creates my API response. Then I'll say return new response entity. Body would be my API response and status would be HTTP status internal server. Okay, done. Now, how do I know that I'm trying to handle this kind of exception? Only you have an annotation called exception handler. Okay, in this exception handler, you basically have something called value, which is basically an array. In this array, you pass exception dot class. Okay, let's go over this thing again. One second. What we did. Okay, I have seen that my insurance controller throws exception and my policy controller throws exception. In both the cases, I'm returning an internal server error as the HTTP status, and data type I'm returning as null, right? Which means for both the controllers, this part is at least common, right? So why don't we move this logic to someplace global? So I've created this class called global exception handler, where I have annotated this with rest at rest controller advice, which means this is going to apply only to all the controllers. Like whatever controllers you have here, okay, whatever controllers you have here, this global exception handler will be applied to all the controllers. Okay, so if any controller throws this type of exception, it will be handled there. It will be handled in this particular class. Okay, so I'm telling, so I have added this thing called exception handler. In here, I have said exception. What type of exception I'm trying to catch? So I'm trying to catch exception type of exception, which is anything. Okay, so I'm handling it here. I'm passing this argument to this. Basically, I'm logging this error, and then I'm saying error response. In error response, I'm passing my error code, and I'm giving my error message here, creating the API response, and then returning the responsibility with the API response, and HTTP status is internal server error. If you see here, the data type of API response is void because it is going to be a null. Okay, that's how I have used this. Okay, so let's just go ahead, and since we have tried this out, let me just go ahead and deliberately throw an exception. Okay, if true, this will deliberately throw an exception. So new exception. Something happened. Okay. Whenever you're trying to create this, unreachable statement, delete unreachable statement. Achha. Let's do this. Achha. Okay, my bad. Just before I return my response, I will be. What will happen is this will deliberately throw a runtime exception, and it will cause a bad request to happen. So now that I have that handling mechanism elsewhere, I can finally remove this part. Okay. So my exception handling mechanism is taken care of by some other time. I'll go ahead and extract my server. Server started. I'll go ahead and create this thing. So this is throwing no policy found, right? So even before it goes inside of this. Don't get confused. I'm just trying to mimic and like system crashes or something by throwing a random exception. You can see here that there is no catch block with exception, which means by default it will be coming here. We should see this handling global exception. So let us start it. Oh, now look at this. If you come here, you see received insurance creation request. We are getting this log from this line, and immediately after that, we're throwing this exception. If you look at this, it says something happened. This was a message, something happened, and it comes from insurance controller.java 53.
Sir,
So,
your voice breaking, sir.
Voice is breaking.
Hello?
How about now?
Sir, your voice is breaking, sir.
Is it breaking for anyone else?
Better, sir.
Is it breaking for anyone
better,
else? It's better now? Okay.
No, sir, it's better.
Okay, fine. So you can see here what I did. Here I actually deliberately threw a runtime exception. I have no way to handle this thing here. If you look at the logs here, it says handling global exception. And if you look at the class name here, it says global exception handler. And we can go here and we can check that this is my global exception handler, and this is where I've put this message. Okay. And this is where I have written this return type, error response null, and this internal server. So what we essentially did is we took out this common part out of here, okay, and I put this inside this global error handling mechanism. REST controller advisor means whatever controllers you have there, apply it on every controller, okay? And then handle only this type of exception, which is exception, okay? This part is clear for everyone. This is how we, I mean, rather than repeating the same thing in every controller, we introduced something called REST Controller Advisor, and there we implemented a global error handling mechanism. Any confusion so far? Cool. Okay, so that is one part. Second part, if you see, there is this thing, insurance policy not found exception. This is a type of exception which is thrown from this insurance controller, and it is also thrown from, is it here? It's also thrown from this registration controller. You can see the registration controller actually captures this insurance policy not found exception. Okay, so for these two controllers, this exception is common, but not for this. Okay, the global exception, which is internal server error, can happen at any point. It can happen at this controller, it can happen at this controller, it can happen at this controller. Okay, but this is a very specific exception which is happening in only two controllers, which is this and this. So is there a way in which we can apply the global exception handler only for these two controllers? Let's take a look at that. So I'll create one more REST controller advisor. I'll say what is the exception here? Exception here is, I'll just say I'll create a class called insurance exceptions handler. Okay, insurance exceptions handler will mostly handle all kinds of insurance specific. This SLF4J for login. I'll do the REST controller part later. Okay. REST controller person. Then here, okay. If you see here, in this, when this thing happens, insurance policy not found exception, we have agreed that we are going to send like policy ID is incorrect, right? This is the error code, this is the error description we'll send, and we'll send the data as none, so, which means that the API response for this can be a void. Okay, so we can go back to our handler here. We can say public response entity, okay, of API response of void. Okay, that's it. Handle invalid. Sorry, insurance policy not found exception. Insurance policy not found exception. Okay. Insurance policy not found exception. Then here I'll say exception handler value insurance policy not found exception class. Okay. And simply here handling insurance exception. Okay. And error response. Okay, what is the code here? ERR001. Okay. No. Or what we can do is we can, instead of writing our own message here, we can just pass the exception message. Okay? Get.message, e.get message. We can pass this thing. Whatever exception is there, we just pass this thing here inside. And then we say final API response of void type. API response. Here the data part will be null. And this would be the error response. Okay, this would have the body as API response and HTTP status done. This much is done. Okay, so this here and this here, they look the same. Okay, this guy here is handling only exceptions. This guy is handling only insurance policy not found exception. But how do we make sure that this insurance exceptions handler applies only to registration controller and insurance controller. How do I make sure it applies only to these and not to policy controller? To do that, you have to basically add this assignable types. You can see there's a property called assignable types. This assignable types takes an array of controllers. Okay, here I'll say insurance controller dot class comma registration controller dot class. Okay, so what is the difference between this and this? Okay, let's compare side by side. This is a global exception handler. This is also a global exception handler. Okay, they both have risk controller, risk controller. Here I'm handling this exception of any type, any generic type, and here I'm handling only a very specific type of exception, which is insurance policy non-farm exception. But this is going to apply to all the controllers because there is no assignable types. So by default, it will apply to all the controllers. This, however, I'm saying assignable types is only insurance controller and registration controller. If something else happens anywhere else, okay, then you like this message can be thrown only from these two files. So let's try that out. What I do is my insurance controller is already throwing this thing. Okay, let's do this. Okay. Instead of doing this, let me deliberately throw this. Okay, insurance policy non-found exception. No insurance policy found. Okay. So I'm deliberately throwing this exception from this class, and let me go ahead and restart the service. If I do this now, something is wrong here. Global exception, no insurance policy. So what is the exception here? Insurance controller, insurance policy. So you can see this thing, ERR001, no insurance policy. Actually, let me go ahead and remove this. I am not going to handle this insurance policy. Okay, which means I will not handle this. Which means so what did we do here? We did this thing, error response, ERR001, policy date exceptions. This will only be handling this. Invalid insurance date. If you look at this controller here, it is throwing insurance policy not found exception, but the catch block here is only capturing insurance policy date exception. which means it won't be captured here. It will be captured at this point here because the assignable types is this. Okay. Let me restart my server. You see that it's coming ER01, no insurance policy. And if you look at the logs here, it's coming handling insurance exceptions, which is coming from insurance exception handler, and it's handling insurance policy not found type of exception. No insurance policy found, and yep, that's it. If you threw, let's say we deliberately throw the same error, okay, from a different class, which is let's say policy control. Okay, in my policy controller here, I'll basically throw this. Okay, so keep in mind that insurance exception handler is applicable only to insurance controller and registration controller. It is not applied to policy controller, which means policy controller only handles duplicate insurance policy exception. It does not handle this insurance policy not found exception, which means that for this policy exception handler, Spring will first check, does this method handle this exception? No, then what is the global exception handler that is handling this error? It won't be able to map this one. It will by default fall to this because it has no assignable types, which means it applies to everything, right? So it will then come here and throw errors. We can verify this. Let me just send a policy controller and just run this over here. And this is the policies. Just do an empty body because it's going to be so right now I'm hitting the policies API with a blank body. And you can see G00 something like. If you come to this point here, you can see handling global exception. No insurance policy found, because the no insurance policy found wala part is actually not handled by your policy control. So it by default is falling to the global exception handler mechanism. Okay. Any questions here? Somebody wants me to repeat this again, how to handle exceptions. So there are three ways we can handle an exception. You can see we can handle an exception here by using this try-catch block. Okay. Or we can handle an exception on the global level. Okay. Or we can handle exceptions for specific controllers like this one. Okay. You have assignable types, this controller. Any questions?
Sir, I have confusion.
Yes.
Global handler exception को कहीं मतलब कंट्रोलर में कॉल भी करना पड़ेगा कि
नहीं ऑटोमेटिकली बेसिकली क्या होता है देखो यहाँ पे तुमने असाइनेबल टाइप्स लिख दिया ना कि ये रेस्ट कंट्रोलर असाइनेबल टाइप्स तुमने जैसे लिख दिया तो वो क्या करेगा स्प्रिंग ऑटोमेटिकली ये दोनों क्लास के लिए मतलब ये दोनों कंट्रोलर के लिए ये अप्लाई करेगा बेसिकली ऐसे होता है इसमें शायद अंडरस्टैंड करना है मान लो हमारे पास 3 कंट्रोलर है ठीक है ये हमारा इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी कंट्रोलर ये हमारा रजिस्ट्रेशन कंट्रोलर ठीक है और ये हमारा पॉलिसी ठीक है तीनों कंट्रोलर अब हमारे पास यहाँ पे बेसिकली 2 रैपर ठीक है ये वाला तुम्हारा ग्लोबल कंट्रोलर हुआ ठीक है ग्लोबल ठीक है और सिमिलरली इंश्योरेंस ठीक है अब कैसे होता है मैंने बोला था ये तुम्हारा इंश्योरेंस वाला है ये तुम्हारा इंश्योरेंस कंट्रोलर है। ये तुम्हारा हो गया रजिस्ट्रेशन। ये तुम्हारा हो गया पॉलिसी। अब कैसे होता है? तुम यहाँ पे बोल रहे हो कि ग्लोबल एक्सेप्शन रेस्ट कंट्रोलर एडवाइस, इसमें बोल रहे हो रेस्ट कंट्रोलर एडवाइस असाइनेबल टाइप्स दिस एंड दिस। तो बेसिकली ये वाला पार्ट इन दोनों को रैप करेगा। फिर तुम बोल रहे हो कि जो ग्लोबल एक्सेप्शन हैंडलर है वो सब में अप्लाई हो। तो बेसिकली ये जो ग्लोबल वाला पार्ट है सब में है। ठीक है, ये समझ में आया?
यस सर, बट इसको कॉल नहीं करना पड़ेगा ना, ऑटोमेटिक कॉल हो जाएगा।
ऑटोमेटिक किसी कुछ भी कॉल करना नहीं पड़ेगा। तुम यहाँ पे बस डाल दो कि कौन सा कंट्रोलर को ये अप्लाई करना पड़ेगा, वो ऑटोमेटिकली उसको रैप कर देगा। जैसे यहाँ पे इंश्योरेंस एक्सेप्शन है, ये दोनों कंट्रोलर पे रैप कर रहे हैं बिकॉज मैंने यहाँ पे मेंशन कर दिया। अगर तुम ग्लोबल वाला करते हो, मतलब यहाँ पे तुम कुछ देते नहीं हो, तो जो भी तुम दोगे वो पूरा जितने सारे कंट्रोलर है वो सब एप्लीकेबल। ठीक है,
ओके सर, गॉट इट।
कूल। एनी मोर क्वेश्चंस?
सर
Abhishek, just type man, your voice
Hello.
is breaking.
yes sir, hello, I'm audible
Yeah,
sir?
yeah, you're audible.
सर एक्चुअली वो हम लोगों ने पहले स्टार्टिंग में जो हमने हैंडल कर रहे थे
हाँ।
स्टार्टिंग में, तो सर तो वो फिर तो ऑन वो 10 वो तो सर फिर किसी काम का नहीं है। देन हम लोग जब इंश्योरेंस एक्सेप्शन जो हम लोग क्रिएट कर रहे हैं जिससे इस ग्लोबल एक्सेप्शन हैंडल इंश्योरेंस एक्सेप्शन हैंडल
हाँ।
के यूज करके सर ये हम लोग हैंडल कर सकते हैं। तो फिर तो देन ये
तो बोलो कि इसका कोई जरूरत नहीं है, कैच का कोई जरूरत नहीं है बोलो।
यस सर।
हाँ नहीं, तो बेसिकली क्यों जरूरत नहीं है देखो, मतलब क्यों जरूरत है देखो। ये जो तुम्हारा पॉलिसी कंट्रोलर है ना, यहाँ पे तुम डुप्लीकेट इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी एक्सेप्शन थ्रो करो। तो कभी कभी ऐसा हो सकता है कि एक कंट्रोलर में एक ऐसा मेथड है जो जो बस मतलब वही अकेला मेथड है जो एक पर्टिकुलर टाइप का एक्सेप्शन थ्रो करेगा एंड वो कहीं और थ्रो नहीं करेगा। तो तुम उसके लिए क्यों एक पर्टिकुलर मतलब ऐसा एक्सेप्शन हैंडलर क्लास बनाओ? बिकॉज फिर तुमको ऐसे लिखना पड़ेगा, इट विल बी जस्ट लाइक दिस। मान लो मेरा एक ये डुप्लीकेट ये वाला पार्ट बस पॉलिसी में कंट्रोल होगा। तो मैं यहाँ पे लिखूंगा पॉलिसी कंट्रोलर डॉट क्लास। ठीक है, इसमें क्या होगा, वो बस उसी जगह पे मतलब अप्लाई होगा, बस उसी कंट्रोल में अप्लाई होगा। उससे अच्छा ये नहीं है कि तुम यहाँ पे आके यहाँ पे ट्राई कैच ब्लॉक लगा दो। लेकिन मान लो तुम्हारे पास यहाँ पे ऐसे चार पांच मेथड, और चार पांच मेथड में से किसी भी मेथड से वो पर्टिकुलर एक्सेप्शन आ सकता है। तो यहाँ पे तुम एक ही जगह पे मतलब सारे मेथड में तुमको सेम इम्प्लीमेंटेशन बार बार डालना पड़ेगा। उस टाइम पे तुम क्या करोगे, तुम वो वाला पार्ट ग्लोबली कहीं पे मूव कर दोगे। तुम यहाँ पे मूव कर दोगे, यहाँ पे तुम पॉलिसी कंट्रोलर लगा दोगे। तो ये क्या करेगा, उस पॉलिसी कंट्रोलर के अंदर किसी भी मेथड से अगर वो एक्सेप्शन थ्रो हुआ तो इट विल कैप्चर दैट पार्ट हियर देयर। इस पॉइंट पे तुम अगर तुम्हारे पास अगर ऐसे कोड है जहाँ पे किसी भी पार्ट से वो आ सकता है एंड रिपीटेड हो रहा है वो चीज, तो तुम यहाँ पे मूव कर सकते हो। बट तुम्हारे पास अगर एक ही मेथड है, मान लो तुम्हारे पास एक सिंगल मेथड है, ठीक है, और बस उसी मेथड से ये पर्टिकुलर एरर आ रहा है, देन तो कोई पॉइंट नहीं बनता है ना एक ऐसे ये बनाने का। बिकॉज बिहाइंड द सीन क्या होता है, ये एक्चुअली एक स्प्रिंग बीन है। ठीक है, तुम अगर यहाँ पे जाओगे ना, ये एक्चुअली इज एन एनोटेशन फॉर कंट्रोलर एडवाइस। अगर तुम कंट्रोलर एडवाइस पे जाओगे तो ये बेसिकली एक स्प्रिंग बीन क्रिएट करता है। ठीक है, तो तुम एक ये थोड़ा मेमोरी ऑक्यूपाई करेगा, फिर ये मतलब गार्बेज कलेक्टेड कभी नहीं होगा। तो तुमको केस बाय केस बेसिस पे करना पड़ेगा। अगर एक्सेप्शन एक ही जगह से आ रहे हैं, मतलब एक ही मेथड से आ रहे हैं, तो उसको उसी लोकली हैंडल कर दो। इसको बोलते हैं लोकल हैंडलिंग। ठीक है, ये ट्राई कैच लगा के इसको बोलते हैं लोकल हैंडलिंग। अगर वो सेम चीज 50 जगह से आ रहे हैं सेम कंट्रोलर के अंदर, तो तुम यहाँ पे कंट्रोलर एडवाइजर बना दो एंड उसमें बस वो कंट्रोलर का नाम डाल दो एंड उस कंट्रोलर में किसी भी मेथड से अगर वो एक्सेप्शन आएगा तो वो वहां पे हैंडल हो जाएगा। अगर तुम्हारा ऐसा है कि मल्टीपल कंट्रोलर से सेम चीज आ रहे हैं तो फिर तुम वहां पे मोर देन वन टाइप ऑफ कंट्रोलर असाइन कर सकते हो एंड वो एक्सेप्शन वहां पे हैंडल हो जाएगा। अगर तुमको हैंडलिंग ग्लोबल लेवल में करना पड़ेगा, ठीक है, तो फिर तुम्हें ऐसा बनाओगे जहां पे तुम कोई कंट्रोलर का नाम नहीं दोगे तो वो बाय डिफॉल्ट सारे कंट्रोलर पे अप्लाई होगा। ठीक है, तो दिस इज हाउ यू टेक अप द स्टेप। दिस इज लोकल हैंडलिंग, दिस इज एक्सट्रीमली ग्लोबल हैंडलिंग, लाइक इसमें कुछ अप्लाई नहीं होता है। ये तुम्हारा मॉडरेटली ग्लोबल है बिकॉज ये बस ये दोनों कंट्रोलर पे आता है। ठीक है, अंडरस्टूड? एनी क्वेश्चंस? Cool. That's all for now. If you don't have any questions, we can end the session.
Sir, my
okay.
code not working. Data
okay.
is not.
ठीक है, let's share the screen. ठीक है, screen share करो।